Hello, my dear friends. You're standing on a balcony overlooking a city at dusk, a city that history has largely forgotten. Below you, the streets of Pataliputra are paved with smooth, dark stone, still warm from the day's sun. The air is thick and sweet, heavy with the scent of night-blooming jasmine, temple incense, and a deep, woody aroma that seems to emanate from the very soul of the buildings, sandalwood. It's the perfume of piety, of poetry, of an empire at its zenith. It's a scent that promises enlightenment and peace. But let's be honest, if you were truly here, breathing this air, you probably wouldn't last the week. The water would likely kill you, or a fever, or perhaps the sheer shock of a world without your modern comforts. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now find that perfect spot, imagine this ancient, perfumed air filling your lungs, and let yourself drift. Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. We are going to stay here for a while, on this balcony, suspended in the golden age of India, the time of the Gupta Empire. From this vantage point, everything seems perfect, doesn't it? The history books paint this era with a brush dipped in gold. They tell of breathtaking advances in mathematics and astronomy, of poets and playwrights crafting masterpieces, of a society so advanced it feels almost mythical. The illusion is one of effortless grace. The prevailing story is that this was a time of serene intellect, of spiritual depth, a civilization that ran on philosophy and prayer. And that scent, that ubiquitous, calming scent of sandalwood, is the anchor for this entire illusion. It was a fragrance deliberately cultivated by the powerful. It was burned in temples to honor the gods, infused into the oils that anointed kings, and carved into the delicate screens that filtered the light. In wealthy homes, it was the smell of power, of purity, of a world scrubbed clean of its rough edges. The empire wanted you to believe that it was born from a lotus flower, pristine and divine. But if you stay here on your balcony, and you take a deeper breath, you might notice something else. Just at the edge of the jasmine and sandalwood, there's another scent carried on the evening breeze. It's a sharper, more astringent smell, a metallic tang. It's faint, but it's persistent. And with it comes a sound, a low, rhythmic thump-thump-thump that you might have mistaken for a distant drum in a religious procession. But it's not. It's the sound of hammers. It's the sound of industry. And that sharp smell, that's the smell of hot iron. This is the central secret of the Gupta Empire, the one we'll keep returning to tonight. The contrast between the sandalwood and the iron, the divine and the dirty, the poetry and the forge. For every sublime sculpture of a meditating Buddha, there was a mine spewing dust and a furnace belching black smoke. For every astronomer plotting the stars with unheard-of precision, there were thousands of labourers sweating in the dark, their bodies aching from repetitive, brutal work. The sandalwood was the perfume of the elite, the public face of the empire. But the iron was its skeleton, its muscle, the gritty reality that held the whole beautiful illusion together. Let's follow that scent, that metallic tang. Let's drift away from the perfumed courtyards and float towards the edges of the city, where the glamorous illusion begins to fray. The air grows thicker here, but not with jasmine. It's hazy with smoke. The rhythmic thumping grows louder, more insistent. You are now looking down upon a very different scene. This is a district of workshops, of open-sided forges glowing like angry orange eyes in the twilight. The ground here isn't smooth stone, it's packed earth, black with soot and littered with slag, the glassy, unwanted byproduct of smelting ore. The men here aren't reciting poetry. They are stripped to the waist, their skin slick with sweat and grime, their muscles coiled like ropes as they swing heavy sledges. This is where the iron is born. The Gupta Empire was not just a philosophical powerhouse, it was an industrial one. They were masters of metallurgy, producing iron of a quality that Europe wouldn't see for another 1,000 years. But this mastery wasn't a clean, scientific process conducted in a lab. It was a violent, elemental, and deeply human struggle. Imagine the heat, a physical wave that hits you even from a distance. Imagine the roar of the clay furnaces, stuffed with charcoal and iron, or fanned by leather bellows worked by boys who should be in school. The process was called forge welding. They would heat small pieces of impure iron, called blooms, until they were white-hot and spitting sparks. Then, With a furious, coordinated rhythm, the smiths would hammer these pieces together, beating out the impurities, the slag, with every deafening blow. Thump, thump, thump. It was a process of purification by violence. Why was this reality so hidden, so deliberately masked by the scent of sandalwood? Because the two worlds were never meant to meet. The social structure of the time, the caste system, was becoming more rigid. The Brahmin priest and the Kshatriya warrior king lived in the world of sandalwood. Their reality was one of ritual purity, of intellectual and spiritual pursuits. The smiths, the miners, the labourers, they belonged to the world of iron. Their work was essential, but it was considered polluting, both physically and spiritually. To admit that the divine king's throne, that the surgeon's blade, that the very nails holding the perfumed palaces together came from this sweaty, noisy, dirty process would be to admit a crack in the perfect fade. It would be to acknowledge that the sacred was built upon the profane. So they separated the worlds with city planning, with social custom, and with scent. The smell of the forge was contained, while the smell of the temple was allowed to permeate. The history of the philosopher was written down, while the history of the smith was forgotten, pounded into the iron itself with every swing of the hammer. The beautiful lie of the Gupta Golden Age is not that the advancements didn't happen, but that they were effortless. The truth is that they were forged. Literally. They were born of fire and sweat and a relentless, percussive violence that was the engine of civilization. The sandalwood sought to soothe and elevate the spirit. The iron sought to conquer and shape the material world. And the story of the Gupta Empire is the story of these two forces, forever bound together, one forever trying to mask the scent of the other. This mastery of iron wasn't just for making tools or nails. It reached its apex in creations that seemed to defy the very laws of nature, objects so perfect they looked like they were delivered by the gods. But as we'll see, even the most miraculous of these inventions, a pillar that stands rust-free to this day, carries within its miraculous chemistry the signature of that hot, dirty, and dangerous forge. That scent of hot iron, that rhythmic beat of the forge, it didn't just create the nails and beams of an empire. It was capable of something more. Something that seems to border on the magical. Let's drift away from the smoky workshops of Pataliputra and travel forward in time, just a little, to a courtyard in what is now Delhi. There, standing in the open air, exposed to monsoon rains and scorching sun for over 1600 years, is a testament to that fiery, violent process. You're looking at the Iron Pillar of Delhi. It stands just over 23 feet tall, a smooth, dark, metallic column that seems to drink the sunlight. The glamorous illusion here is powerful, almost overwhelming. Run your hand over its surface in your mind. It's cool to the touch, and impossibly smooth. There's a strange feeling of permanence about it, as if it wasn't made by human hands at all, but simply grew out of the earth, a silent monument to a forgotten power. The greatest mystery, the one that has baffled metallurgists for centuries, is its purity. It hasn't rusted. While modern iron and steel structures bleed orange stains and crumble into dust, this pillar stands defiant, a quiet rebuke to our own advanced technology. It feels perfect. It feels serene. It feels like a physical manifestation of that sandalwood-scented world, calm, wise, and eternal. It was erected to honor a king, and it carries with it an aura of divine right, of a civilization so advanced its secrets are now lost to us. This is the story it tells from a distance. But we know better, don't we? We know about the forges. The shocking reality is that this pillar is not a symbol of serene perfection, but of brute force, deafening noise, and incredible, life-threatening danger. Let's peel back the centuries and watch it being made. Forget the image of a single, massive piece of metal being poured into a mold. That technology didn't exist. The Gupta smiths couldn't build a furnace large enough or hot enough to melt 7 tons of iron at once. Instead, you are looking at a scene of what can only be described as controlled chaos. The pillar was built piece by piece, disc by fiery disc. Imagine a team of smiths, their bodies glistening with a mixture of sweat and black dust, gathered around a pit. They are working with small iron blooms, just like the ones we saw before, heating them in a charcoal furnace until they glow a blinding yellow-white. Then, with tongs, they haul one of these incandescent lumps onto an anvil. The head smith directs a symphony of destruction. Thump, 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 the hammers fall, not just one, but a team of them, striking in a furious, precise rhythm. They are not just shaping the metal, they are welding it. They hammer a hot piece onto this growing column, beating it, stretching it, forcing it to merge with the piece below. Sparks fly like swarms of angry fireflies, singeing hair and clothes. The heat is so intense it warps the air around them. This isn't the calm work of a scientist. It's a battle against the very nature of the metal. And the pillar is not perfect. Up close, in the fiery light of its own creation, you would see the seams. You would see the hammer marks, tiny imperfections on the surface that have been worn smooth by 16 centuries of wind and hands. You would see how the column is not perfectly uniform, how it swells and tapers in ways that betray its piecemeal construction. It is a mosaic of 1,000 small, violent acts of creation, hammered into the illusion of a single, perfect whole. The danger was immense. A misplaced hammer swing, a slip on the slag-strewn ground, a splash of molten metal, any of these could mean a horrific burn, a lost eye, or worse. This monument to a king was built with this scarred flesh and deafening labour of nameless men. So why has it survived? Why did this brutal, impure process create an object of such impossible purity? The answer is the secret hidden within the iron itself, the reason for the pillar's legendary rust resistance. The why here is a beautiful, historical accident. The iron ore used by the Gupta smiths in this region was naturally high in phosphorus. They didn't know what phosphorus was, of course. They just knew, through generations of trial and error, that iron made from this specific reddish earth was stronger, better. When they were hammering the white-hot iron, they were trying to beat out the impurities, the glassy slag. But they couldn't get it all out. Their process wasn't refined enough. And in that failure lies the genius. The phosphorus from the ore and tiny, microscopic particles of slag remained mixed within the iron. As they hammered and forged, these impurities were distributed throughout the metal. Over time, these elements worked their way to the surface and reacted with the air and moisture, forming an incredibly thin, invisible, protective film, a process called passivation. In other words, the pillar doesn't rust because the very dirt they were trying to beat out of it created a permanent, self-renewing shield. The pillar's perfection is a direct consequence of the imperfection of its own creation. It is a monument built by brute force, protected by the very impurities they tried to expel. The serene, rustless wonder is a lie. It is a beautiful scar, a testament to a dirty, dangerous, and incredibly effective industrial reality that the sandalwood-scented history books would rather forget. This level of control over iron, this ability to shape it for construction and monuments, also meant they could shape it for more intimate and far more terrifying purposes. The same hands that could forge a 7-ton pillar could also forge a blade fine enough to slice through human skin with terrifying precision. The knowledge of metal was not just for building up, but for taking apart. From the grand and public scale of a monumental pillar, let's follow that knowledge of iron as it shrinks, as it gets refined and sharpened and moves indoors. We're leaving the open courtyard and entering a quiet, sunlit room in a hospital attached to a monastery. The air here is cleaner, tinged with the scent of medicinal herbs and clean cotton. Here, the glamorous illusion of the Gupta age shines brightly. You see a physician, a man named Sushruta, or perhaps one of his many disciples, who has authored a text that will be studied for 1,000 years, the Sushruta Samhita. He is depicted as the father of surgery, a figure of immense wisdom and calm. His instruments, laid out neatly on a silk cloth, are a marvel. They are made from that same high-quality iron, sharpened to a razor's edge. There are over 100 different types of surgical tools, forceps, scalpels, catheters, speculums, needles. They are elegant, precise, and deadly serious. The text describes incredible procedures, the setting of bones, the removal of cataracts, even a form of rhinoplasty, rebuilding a nose, which was a surprisingly common need due to its use as a judicial punishment. The image presented is one of clinical precision, of enlightened medicine, a sterile and scientific environment where healing is performed with an almost divine skill. Now, let's look closer. Let's push aside that beautiful illusion and confront the shocking reality. The patient is being held down by several strong assistants, because for all the brilliance of the surgical tools and the anatomical knowledge, there was one forgotten invention that was catastrophically absent: effective anesthesia. The patient was wide awake. The primary form of anesthetic was a copious amount of wine, enough to induce a stupor, but nowhere near enough to block the searing agony of the blade. The most advanced surgical techniques in the ancient world were performed on a fully conscious, terrified, and screaming human being. Imagine the scene. The surgeon, for all his calm and knowledge, must work with incredible speed. His skill is not just in precision, but in haste. The longer the operation takes, the more likely the patient is to die from shock and blood loss. The room, which seemed so serene a moment ago, is now filled with the sounds of muffled cries, of grunts of pain, of the wet, slick sound of the scalpel moving through tissue. The scent of herbs is now overpowered by the coppery tang of fresh blood and the sharp, sour smell of fierce sweat. This wasn't a sterile operating theatre. It was a chamber of exquisite, methodical torture in the name of healing. The beautiful, precise scalpels were instruments of both salvation and agony. For the patient, there was no difference between the healer's knife and the executioner's axe in the moment it touched their skin. The success of these operation depended not just on the surgeon's skill, but on the patient's ability to endure unimaginable pain without moving so much that it caused a fatal slip of the blade. So why? Why would a society capable of such intellectual and metallurgical feats practice medicine in such a brutal fashion? The why here lies in their understanding of the body and consciousness. The Sushruta Samhita is a masterpiece of observation, but it is rooted in a fundamentally different worldview. Their concept of health was based on the balance of three humours or doshas, wind, bile and phlegm. Sickness was a state of imbalance. Surgery was a physical, almost violent, act of restoring that balance. It was a mechanical correction. The patient's subjective experience of pain, while obviously recognized, was secondary to the mechanical purity of the act itself. Consciousness was not seen as something to be switched off. In fact, a good surgeon was expected to be a good psychologist, to talk to the patient, to distract and reassure them even as he was cutting them open. The goal was not to eliminate suffering, but to manage it. Furthermore, their religious and philosophical beliefs played a huge role. The cycle of life, death, and rebirth was a core tenet of their worldview. Pain was a part of life, an unavoidable aspect of existence in the material world. To endure it was, in a way, a spiritual test. It was a form of penance, a burning away of bad karma. A successful surgery was a triumph, but if the patient died, it was part of their karmic path. This fatalistic acceptance allowed them to push the boundaries of surgery without being crippled by the ethical dilemmas that would trouble a modern doctor. They were focused on the outcome, the restoration of function, the rebalancing of the body's physical state. The psychological trauma of the procedure was simply a terrible, but necessary, part of the process. The pristine image of Gupta medicine, with its clean instruments and wise texts, is a half-truth. It omits the screams. It forgets the terror. It sanitizes a reality that was bloody, brutal, and built on a foundation of almost superhuman endurance from its patients. The same iron that built the silent pillar, that spoke of permanence and power, was here used to create tools that produced the most ephemeral and horrifying of sounds. The iron was a neutral tool, but in the hands of the surgeon, it revealed the vast, terrifying gap between intellectual brilliance and the lived reality of the human body. The same mindset, this ability to see a brutal act as a necessary step towards a refined goal, was also applied to their games and pastimes. Let's move away from the intensity of the operating room and into the refined atmosphere of a royal court. The air here is once again thick with that signature scent of sandalwood and expensive perfumes. You see two noblemen, seated on plush cushions across a low, inlaid table. They are leaning forward in quiet concentration, their minds locked in a silent battle. Between them is a board, divided into 64 squares, populated with small, exquisitely carved figures. This is the birthplace of chess, a game called chaturanga. The glamorous illusion is one of pure intellectual sport. It's seen as the ultimate game of strategy and foresight, a pastime for kings and scholars. The pieces themselves are works of art: elephants carved from ivory, horses with flared nostrils, foot soldiers in perfect detail. The game is slow, deliberate, a civilized and bloodless contest of wits. It represents the height of Gupta refinement, a world where conflicts are resolved through intellect rather than brute force. It is the very picture of enlightened leisure. But that is a beautiful and dangerous misunderstanding. The shocking reality is that chaturanga was never just a game. It was a weapon. It was a military training simulator, a ruthless tool for teaching and perfecting the art of slaughter on a grand scale. Look at the pieces again. They are not abstract symbols. They are the 4 divisions of the Gupta military, the infantry Pada, the cavalry Ashva, the elephants Hasty, and the chariots Ratha. The King Raja stands at the center, the most important piece, yet also the most vulnerable. This wasn't an abstract contest. It was a war game. Every move you make on that board corresponds to a tactical decision that would, in the real world, cost hundreds of lives. The quiet, thoughtful stroking of a chin before moving a piece is the sanitized equivalent of a general on a hilltop deciding which flank to sacrifice, which village to burn to gain a strategic advantage. The ivory king in your hand, so smooth and cool to the touch, represents a real king, and his capture doesn't just mean the end of the game. It means the collapse of an army, the sacking of a city, the enslavement of a population. The bloody purpose of the game was to strip warfare of its chaos, its terror, and its gore, and distill it into a set of pure, cold, tactical principles. It was designed to train a young prince or a general to see a battlefield not as a terrifying mess of screaming men and dying animals, but as a system of interlocking forces, a puzzle to be solved. To become a master of Chaturanga was to learn how to dissociate, to view your soldiers, your pawns, as expendable resources. It taught a brutal, necessary calculus: sacrifice this squadron of cavalry to break the enemy's line, lose these foot soldiers to protect your more valuable elephant corps. The game was a psychological conditioning tool, hardening the hearts of the elite against the true cost of their decisions. So why create such a thing? Why turn the grim reality of war into a beautiful parlor game? The why is rooted in the political and military reality of the Gupta Empire. While the history books often portray it as a period of peace, the Pax Guptanath's peace was not a gift. It was maintained by a constant, looming threat of military force. The empire was surrounded by rivals and had to contend with internal rebellions. A king who was not a brilliant military strategist would not be king for long. But you cannot keep an army perpetually at war. It's expensive, it's exhausting, and it's unpopular. Chaturanga was the solution. It was a way to keep the strategic mind of the ruling class razor sharp during times of peace. It was a constant, low-stakes drill. It also served a crucial social function. The game reinforced the rigid hierarchy of the state. The king is all-important, the pawns are numerous and disposable. The different military branches have unique powers and must work together under a single, unified command. Playing the game was a way of internalizing the political philosophy of the empire. Everyone has their place, and the lower orders must be willing to be sacrificed for the good of the state, which is embodied by the king. It was propaganda carved from the free. It turned the brutal logic of feudal warfare into an elegant and addictive pastime. The beautiful game of chess, which we now see as a symbol of pure intelligence, was born as a tool to teach the powerful how to send the powerless to their deaths without flinching. It was the ultimate abstraction of the violence that underpinned their entire society. The ivory used to carve these little instruments of war, like the silk used for the clothes of the courtiers playing the game, was a luxury item. It projected an image of wealth and effortless grace. But like the iron, and like the game itself, the story of its production was far from beautiful. The journey from a living creature to a finished luxury product was often a foul and corrosive process, one that the final consumer would never want to imagine. Let's remain in the court, in this world of refined games and quiet luxury. Look around at the people playing Chaturanga. Notice what they are wearing. Your eyes are drawn to these vibrant colors and the soft, shimmering textures of their clothing. They are draped in cottons of the purest white and silks that flow like liquid light, dyed in hues of deep indigo, rich madder red, and a brilliant saffron yellow. The glamorous illusion here is one of natural, effortless beauty. The empire was famous for its textiles, a source of immense wealth and a key export that traveled the Silk Road. The fabrics seemed to be a gift from nature itself, as if the colors were simply plucked from flowers and sunsets and infused directly into the cloth. The wealthy courtier, dressed in a whisper-soft silk dhoti, projects an image of being utterly disconnected from manual labor, from anything dirty or coarse. Their clothing is a second skin of pure, untroubled elegance. But if you could smell the journey of that silk, if you could trace its path back from the courtier's body to its creation, you would recoil. The shocking reality is that the creation of these beautiful textiles was a journey through a landscape of foul odors, corrosive chemicals, and industrial-scale grime. Let's drift back to the outskirts of the city, not far from the iron forges, to the dyer's district. The air here doesn't smell of sandalwood, it smells acrid and sharp, with an underlying funk of decay and something vaguely like ammonia. You are looking at rows of enormous clay vats, bubbling and steaming under the sun. To achieve that brilliant indigo blue, for example, the dyers had to ferment the leaves of the indigo plant. This process involved soaking the leaves in water for days until they began to rot, releasing the dye compound. To make the dye bind to the fabric, they needed an alkaline solution. The most common source: stale urine. The dyer's workshop would have large pots set aside for collecting it. The raw silk or cotton would be plumbed into this foul-smelling, fermenting concoction, stirred with long poles by men whose hands and arms were permanently stained a deep, zombie-like. Forget that rich red. They used the root of the madder plant, but it had to be prepared with harsh metallic salts called mordants, often alum or even iron sulfates, to fix the color. These vats were cauldrons of chemical reactions understood through generations of trial and error, not through a clean, written formula. The ground around them was stained with colorful, toxic runoff. The production of the silk itself was no prettier. The silk threads are produced by silkworms, which spin a cocoon around themselves. To get a single, unbroken thread, the cocoon has to be harvested before the moth hatches. How do they do that? By boiling the cocoons, with the living creature still inside. You would see vast baskets of these cocoons being plunged into steaming water, a silent, tiny massacre repeated millions of times over to produce a single bolt of shimmering cloth. The delicate, ethereal fabric worn by the queen was born from a silent, boiling death. The vibrant colors, that looked so pure and natural, were the result of fermentation, decay, and caustic chemicals. The world of high fashion was built directly on top of a world of industrial filth. And what is the why behind this stark contrast? It is, once again, about purity, but this time a deliberate and calculated separation of production and consumption. The caste system was at play here, more strongly than ever. The work of tanning leather, of dyeing cloth, of anything that involved filth, decay, or chemicals, was considered ritually polluting. It was relegated to the lowest rungs of the social ladder. The people who made these beautiful things were seen as inherently unclean. This created a profound psychological and physical distance. The wealthy courtier could wear their indigo silk without ever having to imagine the vat of stale urine it came from. The merchant who sold it could praise its heavenly hue without ever acknowledging the stained hands of the person who made it. This system was economically brilliant. It allowed for the mass production of luxury goods while maintaining the social illusion of purity for the elite. The ugliness of the process was not just a byproduct, it was a necessary, structural part of the system. By deeming the producers unclean, the elite could enjoy the products without being tainted by the reality of their creation. It was a form of magic trick. The audience was shown a beautiful silk scarf, and the grimy, smelly, and morally unsettling apparatus used to create it was hidden behind the curtain of social hierarchy. The glamorous textile was the final, sanitized product of a deeply unsanitary process. The empire's wealth was woven from threads of beauty and hypocrisy, dyed in colors that were as brilliant as they were foul in their making. This obsession with systems, with order, and with tracking wealth wasn't just confined to the military or to textile production. It bled into the most abstract realms of their thought, leading to one of the most powerful and revolutionary inventions in human history. But its origins were, as always, far more practical and mundane than the legend suggests. Let's leave the smelly dyer's vats and the forges behind and move into a place of quiet contemplation. We're inside a university, perhaps the Great Nalanda, or a smaller monastery school. Here, surrounded by scrolls of dried palm leaves, a scholar-monk sits in deep meditation. The air is still, the light soft. The glamorous illusion is that of pure, untethered intellectual discovery. This is where the great mathematical leaps of the Gupta period were born. And the greatest of them all was the concept of zero, not just as a placeholder, which the Babylonians had, but as a number in its own right. A number you could add, subtract, and multiply. A number that represented both nothing and the potential for everything. This is presented as one of the most profound philosophical achievements in history. The invention of shunya, or emptiness, seems to be a natural extension of Buddhist and Hindu philosophies about the nature of the void and the cosmos. It's a story of a culture so spiritually and intellectually advanced that it could literally conceive of nothing and give it a name and a power. It is the pinnacle of abstract thought, a gift to the world from a mind freed from material concerns. But this serene image of philosophical discovery is just that, an image. Let's pull back the curtain. The shocking reality is that the widespread adoption and formalization of zero wasn't driven by monks meditating on the cosmic void. It was driven by the far more mundane and grasping needs of the taxman. The engine behind this profound mathematical leap was the state's insatiable need to count, to record, and to control every last coin and grain of rice in its vast domain. Imagine not a scholar, but a harried-looking bureaucrat in a dusty state granary. He's not contemplating the infinite, he's trying to do accounting. Before this formal concept of zero, bookkeeping was a nightmare. You had column-based abacuses and counting boards, but recording the results was clumsy. How do you write down the number 207? How do you distinguish it from 27? You might leave a space, but that was ambiguous and prone to error. Now imagine trying to calculate the taxes owed by a village that harvested 500 bushels of wheat, but had a drought credit of 50 bushels. The calculations were messy, slow, and easy to fudge. For a sprawling empire with a complex economy, this was not just an inconvenience, it was a critical vulnerability. The state was losing money, power, and control because its accounting system was inefficient. Zero was the solution. The little dot, the bindu, that represented Shunya, was a revolution in bureaucratic efficiency. Suddenly, the tax collector, the granary manager, the royal treasurer could record vast and complex numbers with perfect clarity. 207 was now unambiguously 207. Records became precise. Calculations became faster and more reliable. The invention of zero as a full-fledged number allowed for the development of the decimal system and the algorithms for addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division that we still use today. These weren't developed for cosmic poetry. They were developed for crunching the numbers of empire. They were tools for ensuring that every citizen paid their exact due, that every transaction was logged, that the king knew precisely how much wealth he controlled. Zero wasn't just the void. It was the decimal point in the emperor's ledger. So, why the persistent myth of the philosophical origin? The why is a classic case of history being written by the winners, or in this case, by the most eloquent. The scholars and monks who wrote the great mathematical texts, like Gupta, were certainly interested in the philosophical implications of zero. They explored its strange properties, like what happens when you divide by it. They couched their work in the beautiful, abstract language of philosophy and astronomy, because that was the prestigious language of their class. It was far more noble to present your work as a quest for cosmic truth than as a tool to help the taxman be more effective. The Brahmins who dominated the intellectual sphere framed the discovery in terms that elevated their own status and worldview. They retroactively applied the sandalwood perfume to what was, at its heart, a tool of cold, hard iron. The state, for its part, was happy to let them. By framing this bureaucratic tool as a profound spiritual achievement, it added to the mystique and glory of the empire. It suggested that the Gupta state was not just powerful, but enlightened. The truth is that the two forces needed each other. The philosophers provided the elegant theories and the intellectual framework, but the state provided the demand, the funding, and the practical application that drove the innovation forward. The concept of Shunya may have roots in spiritual thought, but it was the gritty, practical need for accounting and control that made it a cornerstone of the empire and, eventually, the world. The most spiritual of numbers was, in reality, the most brutally practical. It was the invention that allowed the empire to hold its subjects in a tight, mathematical grasp. This drive to impose order on the world, to shape it and record it, was not limited to numbers on a page. It was also carved in stone. Let's drift away from the world of numbers and ledgers and travel to a hillside where a great work is underway. We find ourselves before the site of what will become the Ajanta or Ellora caves. The glamorous illusion here is one of divine inspiration and artistic devotion. You see the finished product in your mind's eye, vast temples carved directly out of the living rock, intricate halls filled with pillars and serene, larger-than-life statues of Buddha and Hindu deities. The walls are covered in breathtaking murals, telling stories from mythology in vivid color. It feels as if the gods themselves guided the hands of the artisans. The official story is one of faith that these magnificent structures were created over centuries by monks and artists in a collective act of pious devotion. The result is a place that feels otherworldly, a silent, stone sanctuary that transcends the messiness of human effort. It seems to have been wished into existence through sheer spiritual will. Now, let's shatter that illusion. Let's wind back the clock and watch the work as it happens. The shocking reality is that creating these temples was not a serene act of artistry. It was a brutal, noisy, and incredibly dangerous feat of engineering and manual labor, closer to mining than to sculpture. Forget the gentle tap-tap-tap of a sculptor's chisel. The first sound you would hear is the deafening ring of heavy iron picks and sledges against rock. Before any fine carving could begin, thousands of tons of solid basalt had to be quarried and removed. You are looking at a swarm of workers, their bodies lean and hard, clinging to the cliff face on rickety bamboo scaffolding. Their world is a constant vibration that travels from the rock face, up their tools, and into their bones. The air is not clear and still, it is choked with a fine, sharp stone dust that coats everything, filling their lungs and leading to a slow, agonizing death from silicosis. There are no divine guides here. There is a foreman, shouting orders. There are teams of men and boys hauling away baskets of rubble, their backs bent under the weight. The initial carving was done with brute force. They would carve deep channels into the rock and then, using iron wedges and levers, pry massive chunks of stone free. A miscalculation, a flaw in the rock, and a multi-ton block could come crashing down, taking scaffolding and workers with it. The beautiful, serene face of a giant Buddha was not gently coaxed from the stone. It was born from a violent assault on a mountain. The delicate details were the final step in a long, grueling process that began with sweat, muscle, and the clang of that familiar Gupta iron. The why behind this method, this willingness to undertake such a Herculean and hazardous task, is a combination of ambition, permanence, and the availability of a specific kind of resource, disposable labor. The Gupta rulers and the wealthy merchant guilds who patronized these projects wanted to leave a mark that would last for eternity. A wooden temple will rot. A brick one can crumble. But a temple carved from a solid mountain is forever. It was the ultimate statement of power and piety. They were creating, quite literally, an immovable fact. This desire for permanence overshadowed any concern for the human cost. The social structure, the caste system, made this possible. The master architects and the high-ranking monks who conceived of the designs lived in a world of sandalwood, of plans and philosophy. But the men who did the actual work, the quarrymen, the labourers, were from the lowest castes. They were seen as expendable. Their lives were not recorded. Their names are not carved into the walls alongside the gods. They were the human machinery of the project. This rigid social hierarchy allowed the patrons to commission these works with a clear conscience. The suffering of the labourers was not seen as a tragedy. It was simply the natural order of things, the necessary, dirty work required to create something divine. The project was a microcosm of the empire itself, a glorious, divinely inspired vision at the top, built upon the anonymous, back-breaking and often lethal labour of those at the bottom. The fine carving, when it finally began, was also a testament to that high-quality iron we keep encountering. The chisels had to be hard enough to hold an edge against the basalt, a testament to the smiths back in their smoky forges. Every delicate curl of a god's hair, every fold in a celestial being's robe, was made possible by the same industrial process that built the rustless pillar. The contrast is jarring. The silent, eternal peace of the finished cave temple is a lie. It is a monument that has deliberately forgotten the noise, the dust, and the blood that went into its creation. It is the ultimate expression of the empire's central theme, the beautiful, spiritual illusion built upon a hard, industrial, and often brutal reality. The patrons who funded these temples would visit, not to work, but to pray and admire. They would arrive cloaked in perfumes designed to enhance their sense of spiritual purity and to mask the lingering scent of the common world. But the secrets of those perfumes were just as complex and stomach-turning as the secrets of the temples themselves. Let's glide back to the royal court, into the opulent halls where power is consolidated and displayed. We've seen their games, their clothes, their numbers. Now, let's focus on the very air they breathe. The glamorous illusion is an atmosphere of pure, divine fragrance. The air is deliberately and constantly perfumed. Sandalwood, as we know, is the base note of the empire, but it's far from the only scent. Attendants move silently through the rooms with smoking censers, wafting complex aromas of jasmine, rose, spikenard, and saffron. The courtiers themselves are walking works of olfactory art. Their clothes are scented, Their hair is oiled with fragrant unguents and their skin glows from perfumed lotions. The goal is to create a personal scent aura, a fragrant bubble that announces their status, their refinement and their purity. To smell good was not a matter of simple hygiene. It was a moral and political statement. It signaled that you belonged to the elite world, a world that was literally and figuratively above the stench of common life. But if you lean in closer, past the cloud of flowers and spices, you might detect a ghost of something else in their expensive perfumes. A faint, musky, animalic note that gives the fragrance its depth and, more importantly, its staying power. The shocking reality is that the most luxurious and sought-after perfumes of the Gupta court were not purely botanical. They were built upon a foundation of bizarre and often stomach-turning animal secretions. The secret to a long-lasting, sophisticated perfume was a touch of the grotesque. One of the most prized ingredients was musk. It's a beautiful, warm, and deeply sensual scent. But where does it come from? It's a secretion from a gland near the rectum of the male musk deer, a small, shy creature from the Himalayan mountains. To get the musk pod, the deer had to be hunted and killed. The gland would be cut from its body, dried, and the pungent, waxy substance inside collected. That divine, alluring scent that a noble lady wore to a poetry reading was made possible by a hunter tracking and killing an animal, then scraping a gland from its hindquarters. Another key ingredient was civet. This was a paste-like secretion scraped from the perineal glands of the civet cat. The animals were often kept in cages and deliberately agitated to increase their production of the substance. The raw paste itself has an intensely fecal, repulsive odor. It was only through massive dilution and skillful blending with other ingredients that its aversive qualities transformed into a powerful, floral-enhancing fixative. Then there was ambergris, a waxy, grey substance that was one of the most valuable materials in the ancient world. It was found floating in the ocean, or washed up on beaches. For centuries, no one knew what it was. We now know it is, essentially, a vomit ball from a sperm whale hardened, intestinal slurry formed around squid beaks to protect the whale's digestive tract, which is then expelled. That lump of whale bile, aged by sun and salt water, was worth more than its weight in gold and formed the base of the most exclusive royal perfumes. So why this reliance on the revolting? The why is a matter of pure chemistry, understood through empirical observation. These animalic substances are rich in compounds that act as powerful fixatives. They bind the more volatile floral and spice scents to the skin, preventing them from evaporating quickly. A simple rose oil might vanish in an hour. Rose oil blended with a touch of civet or musk would last all day. The animalic note added a complexity, a base note, that made the perfume feel more alive, more like a second skin. It was the secret ingredient that separated the cheap, simple perfumes of the marketplace from the sophisticated, long-lasting creations worn at court. The master perfumers of the Gupta era were like alchemists, transforming the foul into the fragrant. This practice also perfectly illustrates the empire's core deception. The elite could surround themselves with these complex fragrances, feeling pure and elevated, precisely because they were utterly disconnected from the source. The noble would never see the caged civet cat or the disemboweled deer. They only experienced the final, magical product. The process of acquiring and preparing these ingredients was, like dyeing and mining, considered unclean work. It was done by specialized hunters and traders, people who lived on the fringes. The system created a buffer of ignorance. It allowed the consumer to enjoy the illusion of pure, botanical beauty while unknowingly wearing a scent built on a foundation of animal secretions, glandular scrapings and whale vomit. The perfume was a lie you could smell. It was the sandalwood illusion taken to its most intimate and personal level, a fragrant mask hiding a wild and unsettling reality. This obsession with purity and authenticity wasn't just olfactory, it was also economic, especially when it came to the very symbol of wealth itself. From the invisible world of scent, let's turn our attention to something you can hold. In your hand, something solid and reassuringly heavy. We are in a bustling marketplace, the heart of commerce. A merchant bites down on a coin just handed to him. It's a gold dinar from the reign of a great Gupta king like Samdragupta or Chandragupta Seh. The glamorous illusion of this coin is one of absolute power and stability. It is a perfect circle of nearly pure gold, stamped with a powerful and clear image. On one side, the king is depicted as a heroic figure, mighty archer, a lion slayer, a divine figure blessed by the gods. On the other, the goddess Lakshmi sits on a lotus, a symbol of wealth and prosperity. The coin is not just money, it's a piece of propaganda. It broadcasts a message of a glorious, divinely ordained, and incredibly wealthy empire. It feels eternal, a tiny, incorruptible piece of the golden age. To hold it is to feel the confidence and permanence of the Gupta state. Now, look closer at the transaction. The merchant isn't admiring the art. He's testing the coin's authenticity. The shocking reality is that for every official mint producing these pristine symbols of power, there were countless hidden workshops and clandestine forgers working to undermine them. The beautiful gold coin in your hand was one of the most counterfeited objects in the empire. The stability it projected was a fragile fade, constantly under assault from within. The state was engaged in a relentless, high-stakes war against forgery. Imagine a back-alley workshop, not unlike the dyers or the smiths. In the flickering lamplight, a craftsman is carefully crafting a fake. He might be a master of the art, creating a die that almost perfectly mimics the king's official one. More likely, he's using a simpler method. He could be making a mold from a real coin and casting a copy using a cheaper base metal alloy bronze or copper and then coating it with a thin layer of gold leaf. This is called a fora. To an unsuspecting person, it looks and feels right. But with a little wear, the gold would rub off, revealing the worthless metal beneath. Another technique was to take a real gold coin, shave a tiny amount of gold from its edge and pass the slightly lighter coin back into circulation. Do this 100 times and you have enough gold shavings to melt down and create a new, albeit slightly impure, coin. The very existence of these forgeries reveals a hidden truth about the empire. Its prosperity was not evenly distributed. While the king and the goddess on the coin projected an image of universal wealth, many people were struggling. Forgery was a desperate act for some, a get-rich-quick scheme for others. It was a symptom of the economic pressures and inequalities that the official story, stamped in gold, sought to deny. The state's response was brutal. The Arthashastra, an older text but one whose principles were still influential, prescribed horrific punishments for counterfeiters being cut to pieces was one suggestion. The severity of this punishment tells you how serious the threat was. The pristine image of the coin was maintained by a system of violent deterrence. The why behind this constant battle goes to the heart of what money is. The gold coin's value was not just in its material worth, but in the state's guarantee. The king's image was a promise. I, the divine ruler, certify that this disc contains a specific weight of pure gold. A forgery attacks this promise directly. It undermines trust in the entire economic system. If people can't trust their money, they stop using it. They revert to barter. Trade grinds to a halt. The state loses its ability to collect taxes effectively, to pay its soldiers, to fund its grand projects like those rock-cut temples. Counterfeiting was not just a crime, it was treason. It was a direct assault on the king's authority and the stability of his empire. Furthermore, the state itself was not always innocent. Later in the Gupta period, as the empire faced economic strain and foreign invasions, the official mints began to do something suspiciously similar to forgery. They started debasing the currency. The gold content of the diners began to drop. More and more silver and other metals were mixed in, though the coins still bore the same proud images of the king and goddess. The state was, in effect, counterfeiting its own money, trying to stretch its resources and hide its decline. The beautiful gold coin, therefore, is a double lie. It masks the secret history of the criminal forger trying to cheat the system from below, and it masks the secret history of the state itself, cheating its own people from above. The perfect, golden disc was the focal point of a hidden, empire-wide battle for trust, a battle fought in back alleys, in marketplaces, and eventually, within the walls of the royal mint itself. This world of intellectual rigor, of precise rules and high-stakes competition, was not confined to the economy. It was the defining feature of the empire's most celebrated centers of learning, which were far from the serene havens of thought they appeared to be. Let's drift away from the clamor of the marketplace and seek refuge in what should be the most peaceful and enlightened place in the entire empire. You are floating through the vast, sprawling campus of Nalanda University. The glamorous illusion is that of a tranquil academic paradise, the Harvard or Oxford of its day. Imagine thousands of monks and students in saffron robes, walking silently through manicured gardens with lotus ponds. You see them seated in great lecture halls, listening intently to the wisdom of a revered sage, or alone in their cells, peacefully copying sacred texts onto palm leaf manuscripts. The very name Nalanda means giver of knowledge. It's portrayed as a pure sanctuary of learning, a place where the brightest minds from all over Asia gathered for the selfless pursuit of truth, shielded from the grubby concerns of the outside world. It is the empire's intellectual soul, the physical embodiment of its commitment to philosophy, logic, and spiritual growth. But that is a carefully curated postcard image. Let's look beyond the serene gardens and into the hearts and minds of the men who live there. The shocking reality is that Nalanda was a hotbed of ferocious intellectual ambition, brutal academic debates, and cutthroat political maneuvering. This was no gentle exchange of ideas. It was an arena where reputations were made and destroyed. The pursuit of truth was entangled with the pursuit of fame, influence, and power. The serene monastery was, in fact, one of the most competitive environments imaginable. The entrance exams alone were notoriously difficult. A famous Chinese pilgrim, Xuanzang, who studied there, wrote that only 2 or 3 out of every 10 applicants were successful. And those who failed were not gently turned away. They were often humiliated by the gatekeeper scholars, who were renowned for their sharp tongues and logical traps. Once inside, the pressure only increased. Debates were a central part of the curriculum, but they were not friendly discussions. They were formal, public contests where a scholar had to defend his thesis against all comers. To lose a major debate was to suffer a devastating blow to your status. To win was to gain disciples, royal patronage, and a name that would be known across the continent. These debates were the chaturanga of the intellectual world, and the stakes were just as high. Careers were the casualties. Furthermore, Nalanda was not disconnected from the world, it was deeply enmeshed in it. The university was incredibly wealthy, supported by the revenues of hundreds of villages granted to it by Gupta kings and other patrons. This wealth made the position of abbot, the head of the monastery, an incredibly powerful one. The selection of a new abbot was a process rife with factionalism and politics, as different philosophical schools and regional groups vied for control of the institution's vast resources and influence. A scholar's rise through the ranks depended not just on his brilliance, but on his ability to navigate these complex social and political currents, to form alliances and to subtly undermine his rivals. The serene monks in their robes were also players in a high-stakes game of institutional power. So why was this reality of sharp ambition so effectively masked by the image of serene contemplation? The why lies in the very nature of Buddhist philosophy and the need to maintain institutional legitimacy. The official ideal of the Buddhist monk is one who has renounced worldly ambition, desire, and ego. This is the model that had to be projected to the outside world, especially to the pious kings and merchants who funded the university. They were donating their wealth to support a spiritual project, not to fuel the careers of ambitious academics. Therefore, the entire public-facing culture of Nalanda was designed to reinforce this ideal. The language was of selflessness, the architecture was designed to inspire tranquility, and the official histories written by the monks themselves naturally emphasized the institution's spiritual purity. It was a necessary hypocrisy. The fierce competition and ambition were the engines of Nalanda's excellence. The drive to defeat a rival in debate pushed scholars to master logic, to memorize entire libraries of texts, and to formulate new, more powerful philosophical arguments. Ambition fueled the very intellectual rigor that made the university famous. But this engine had to be hidden, clad in a chassis of serene spirituality. The monks were human. They were brilliant, and they were proud. They sought enlightenment, but many also sought recognition. Nalanda's genius was in creating a system that harnessed these very worldly human drives, ergo, ambition, rivalry, and channeled them into the production of profound philosophical and religious thought. The serene sage, meditating in the garden, was a beautiful and necessary lie. His inner world was likely a whirlwind of arguments, career calculations, and the burning desire to utterly demolish his opponent in next week's debate. This same pattern of taking a fundamental human drive and codifying it into an elegant, intellectual system can be seen in another of the Gupta era's most famous and most misunderstood texts, a book that claims to be about love, but is really about something far more practical. Let's stay within this world of texts and refined knowledge, but shift our focus from the institutional to the personal. We enter a private chamber, richly decorated with silks and low, comfortable furniture. A young, wealthy man of the city of Nagaraka is studying a text. This is the Kama Sutra. The glamorous illusion surrounding this book is that it is a scandalous sex manual or, in a more sanitized version, a beautiful and poetic exploration of romantic and erotic love. It's often seen as a symbol of a sexually liberated and enlightened society, one that celebrated physical pleasure as a high art form. The very idea of an ancient culture producing such a frank and detailed text on the art of love seems incredibly sophisticated, a testament to their worldliness and their holistic approach to life. The Kama Sutra is the ultimate symbol of Gupta era refinement in the realm of personal relationships. However, this is a profound and very modern misreading of the text's purpose. Let's look at who the book was written for and what it actually says. The shocking reality is that the Kama Sutra is not primarily a book about love or even sex. It is a pragmatic and at times deeply cynical guide to social climbing and the acquisition of wealth and status, aimed squarely at the ambitious urban gentleman. The detailed descriptions of sexual positions, for which the book is so famous, make up only about a fifth of the text. The rest of it is a detailed manual on how to be a successful man about town. It contains chapters on how to furnish your house to impress visitors, what kind of poetry to recite, how to dress and which perfumes to wear, no doubt using some of those animalic fixatives we encountered earlier. It gives advice on how to judiciously flatter people, how to manage your finances, and, most importantly, how to choose and court a partner who will advance your social standing. The pursuit of pleasure karma is presented not just as an end in itself, but as a tool. A mastery of the arts of seduction and pleasure was a way to gain access to the households of powerful and wealthy people. Courting a courtesan, for instance, wasn't just about pleasure, it was about being seen in the right circles, making connections and learning the gossip of the elite. The text gives cold, calculated advice on how to win a woman's affection, but also on how to extricate yourself from a relationship that is no longer profitable, and even how to swindle money from a lover. It's less the joy of sex and more how to win friends and influence people through sex. So why this disconnect? Why was this practical guide to social maneuvering framed as a treatise on the art of love? The why lies in the very structure of Gupta society and its concept of the good life. The text was written by Vatsyayana, who was likely a scholar or celibate religious student, writing a compilation of existing knowledge rather than a personal memoir. He was codifying one of the three legitimate aims of human life according to Hindu philosophy: dharma, righteous conduct; artha, worldly success and wealth; and karma, pleasure, desire. The Kama Sutra is the textbook for karma, just as the Arthashastra was the textbook for artha. It was an attempt to systematize and apply intellectual rigor to the messy world of human desire, just as Chaturanga systematized war and Zero systematized accounting. By framing this cynical advice within a respectable, philosophical structure, the book made these ruthless social strategies acceptable and even laudable for the sophisticated gentleman. It gave a veneer of intellectual and spiritual legitimacy to what was, essentially, a playbook for social ambition. It allowed the Nagaraka to pursue wealth and influence through seduction, while telling himself he was engaged in the noble, artistic pursuit of pleasure. He wasn't just using people, he was mastering an art form, one of the prescribed goals of a well-lived life. The book is the ultimate expression of the sandalwood illusion applied to personal relationships. It takes the hard, iron-like reality of social competition, the need to marry well, to gain influence, to secure your financial future, and cloaks it in the perfumed, silken language of art, poetry and eroticism. The ideal life for the sophisticated gentleman, as described in the Kama Sutra, was one of leisure spent in beautiful surroundings. His home would have a lush garden, an earthly paradise that reflected his good taste and status. That even these gardens, which seemed to be oases of natural beauty, were products of a hidden system of control and conflict. Let's step out of the Nagaraka's private chamber and into his garden. It is a vision of paradise, a perfect escape from the heat and dust of the city. The glamorous illusion is one of effortless abundance and natural harmony. You see carefully planned flower beds bursting with color, fruit trees heavy with mangoes and pomegranates, and shady groves of flowering ashoka trees. A marble fountain splashes merrily in the center, its water trickling into a lotus pond where Aride scent fish dart beneath the pads. The air is cool and fragrant with jasmine and rose, a private version of the court's perfumed atmosphere. This garden is a status symbol, a demonstration that its owner is a man of such wealth and refinement that he can command nature itself, creating a personal Eden that is always green, always in blue. It is the physical manifestation of a life of leisure and aesthetic pleasure, as prescribed by texts like the Kama Sutra. Now, follow the water. Trace that gentle trickle from the fountain back to its source. The journey will take you out of the city and into the countryside, and the illusion of effortless abundance will evaporate. The shocking reality is that this urban paradise was entirely dependent on a massive, complex, and fiercely contested system of irrigation. The water that fills the rich man's lotus pond is the same water that a farmer miles away desperately needs for his rice paddy. The existence of that lush garden in the city was a direct consequence of a power struggle over water in the fields. The Gupta Empire was a hydraulic society. Its agricultural wealth, which formed the foundation of its entire economy and paid the taxes recorded with the help of zero, depended on the masterful management of water. They built vast reservoirs, tadagas, dams, canals, and wells. They developed sophisticated tools like the water wheel, or argata, a system of pots on a wheel, often powered by oxen or humans, that could lift water from a deep well or river to irrigate higher ground. This technology was a marvel of engineering, allowing them to turn semi-arid land into productive farmland and to secure multiple harvests per year. But this system was not a harmonious collective effort. It was a source of constant social friction. Water rights were a source of bitter disputes. Who got water first? How much could they take? What happened during a drought when the reservoir was low? These conflicts played out between villages, between different castes within a village, and between powerful landowners and poor tenant farmers. Local councils and royal officials spent a huge amount of their time adjudicating these water disputes. A royal inscription might praise the king for gifting a reservoir to the people, but on the ground, that gift would immediately become a focal point of jealousy and conflict. The powerful landlord whose lands were closest to the new canal would thrive, while the farmer at the end of the line might find the flow reduced to a muddy trickle. That serene garden in Pataliputra was green because a powerful courtier had the influence to ensure his water supply was prioritized, often at the expense of someone less powerful. So why was this reality of conflict hidden behind the image of the tranquil garden? The why is about the deliberate creation of a narrative of royal benevolence and cosmic order. The king's primary duty, in the eyes of his subjects, was to ensure prosperity. And prosperity meant good harvests, which meant water. By building these massive irrigation projects, the king was not just being an engineer, he was performing a sacred duty. He was acting as an earthly reflection of the rain god, Indra, bringing life-giving water to the land. The inscriptions and official court poetry would therefore focus on the glorious gift, the act of divine generosity, not the messy, human squabbles that inevitably followed. The garden of the wealthy Nagaraka served as a miniature, private version of this royal propaganda. It was a symbol that its owner was living in harmony with nature and enjoying the fruits of a well-ordered, prosperous society. It was a beautiful lie that helped him forget and helped his visitors forget that this prosperity was not a natural state, but a manufactured one, built on a system that was rife with inequality and conflict. The garden was a carefully constructed piece of stagecraft, a sandalwood-scented space that masked the iron-hard realities of resource competition. It was an island of curated serenity, made possible only by the power to control and divert a life or death resource from those who needed it more. This tension between the serene public image and the fraught reality of power extended all the way to the very top of the imperial structure, the throne of the king himself. Let's travel to the very heart of the empire, the epicenter of power, the royal throne room. Here, the glamorous illusion is at its most potent and most carefully constructed. You see the Gupta king, the Maharajadharaja, the great king of kings, seated on a magnificent throne of carved wood and gold. He is draped in the finest, most brilliantly coloured silks, adorned with ropes of pearls and flawless gems. His posture is serene, his expression calm and divinely remote. He is surrounded by attendants who wave peacock feathers to cool the air and by courtiers who bow so low their heads touch the polished floor. The court poets sing his praises, comparing him to the gods, to Vishnu, the preserver, to Varuna, the king of cosmic order. The golden coins that circulate through his empire carry his heroic image. Everything in this room, from the architecture to the etiquette, is designed to project an image of absolute, unquestionable, and divinely sanctioned power. He is not just a man, he is the stable center of the universe. But now, let's look past the silks and the gold. Let's try to see what the king himself sees. The shocking reality is that this divine figure was likely a man consumed by paranoia, and his throne, for all its splendor, was a seat of profound fear and instability. The illusion of godlike security was a fragile mask, hiding a constant life-or-death struggle against rivals, assassins and rebellions. The serene king was, in all likelihood, the most frightened man in the empire. His food and wine were almost certainly tasted by a designated food taster, lest they be poisoned. He slept in a guarded chamber, and it said some kings would even change their sleeping quarters randomly to thwart assassins. His closest relatives, his brothers, his sons are his most dangerous rivals. The history of royal succession is a brutal story. A king's death was often the trigger for a bloody civil war among his sons, each eager to claim the throne. A wise king would therefore keep his ambitious relatives far from the capital, on distant military campaigns, or even subtly remove them. The smiling courtier bowing before him might be part of a conspiracy. The general leading his armies on the frontier could be plotting a coup. The king's world was one of whispers, of spies, of double meanings. He had to be a master of reading people, of discerning loyalty from flattery, of projecting an aura of invincibility even when he felt most vulnerable. Megasthenes, a Greek ambassador who visited an earlier Indian court but whose descriptions of court life remained relevant, wrote of the king's immense security detail and the constant fear of assassination. The king's life was a gilded cage. When he left the palace, it was in a grand procession, surrounded by armed guards and even a retinue of female bodyguards, who were considered incorruptible. This wasn't just for show, it was a deadly necessity. The calm, divine image was a full-time job, and a single moment of weakness, or a single misplaced trust could be fatal. What is the why behind this extreme and paradoxical situation? Why build such a powerful illusion of security around such a dangerous reality? The reason is that the king's divine image was his primary weapon. The Gupta Empire was not a modern nation-state with a clear, bureaucratic line of succession. It was a patchwork of vassal states, conquered territories, and allied kingdoms, all held together by the perceived power and charisma of the central ruler. His authority was not based on a constitution, it was based on the belief that he was a Chakravartin, a universal ruler, chosen by the gods. If that belief faltered, if the king appeared weak, fearful, or merely human, the whole imperial structure could begin to unravel. Vassals would stop paying tribute, rivals would be emboldened, and the empire could fracture. The entire performance of divine kingship, the godlike titles, this elaborate court ritual, the heroic images on coins as a crucial piece of political technology. It was a psychological tool for manufacturing consent and deterring rebellion. It was far cheaper and more effective to control people with awe than with soldiers alone. Therefore, the king had to live inside this illusion, no matter the personal cost. He was the chief actor and the chief prisoner in his own play. His paranoia was not a sign of madness, it was a sign of his political intelligence. He understood the fragile, theatrical nature of his own power. The sandalwood-scented air of the court was meant to project peace and permanence, but for the king, it was likely thick with the metallic taste of fear, the ever-present threat of the assassin's iron blade. This high-stakes world, where appearance was everything, also informed their approach to medicine. The physicians who tended to the king and his court had to be masters of diagnosis, able to see inside the body's secrets. And their methods for doing so were as intimate as they were, at times, unsettling. Let's move from the throne room to the quieter, more clinical chambers of the royal physician. The king, for all his divine posturing, is still a man of flesh and blood, susceptible to illness. The glamorous illusion here is of a wise, holistic healer. Drawing on the principles of Ayurveda, the science of life, the physician is a figure of immense knowledge and perception. He doesn't just look at a single symptom. He assesses the patient's entire being, their diet, their lifestyle, their mental state. The texts describe a system of diagnosis based on the balance of the three doshas: wind, bile, phlegm, the 7 primary tissues datus, and the 3 waste products malus. The ideal physician is almost a sage, able to diagnose complex internal ailments through subtle, non-invasive observation, by checking the pulse, observing the tongue, and listening carefully to the patient's voice. It's a picture of deep, intuitive wisdom, a medical practice that is as much a spiritual art as it is a science. But this picture of gentle, hands-off observation is incomplete. While these subtle methods were indeed part of the diagnostic toolkit, they were supplemented by a shocking reality. The wise physician was also required to engage in a deeply personal and, to our modern sensibilities, unsavory inspection of the patient's bodily fluids. To truly understand the internal state of the body, The Ayurvedic texts insisted that the doctor must directly examine a patient's urine, feces, sweat, and vomit. This was not a quick, detached glance. It was a detailed sensory analysis. Imagine the scene. A sample of the royal patient's urine is brought to the physician in a clay pot. He doesn't just look at the color and clarity. The Sushruta Samhita and other texts advised the physician to taste it. The sweetness of urine, for example, was a key indicator of what we now call diabetes, an affliction they called madhumeha, or honey urine. The physician was the original laboratory test. He would also smell it, noting any unusual odors. He would even perform a primitive form of ant-based glucometry, pouring a little on the ground to see if ants were attracted to it, another sign of sugar. He would examine the patient's stool for color, consistency, odor, and the presence of undigested food or blood. This wasn't just a job for an assistant. This intimate analysis was considered a crucial diagnostic skill of the master physician himself. So why this incredibly visceral, stomach-turning approach? The why is rooted in their fundamental theory of medicine. For the Ayurvedic physician, the body was a microcosm of the universe, a chemical system where inputs, food, drink, air were processed into the body's tissues, with the remainder expelled as waste. The waste products were not just refuse, they were a direct, readable printout of the body's internal metabolic processes. If the internal fire agni of digestion was weak, food would pass through undigested. If a certain dosha was in excess, it would manifest with a particular color, smell, or even taste in the urine. For the Gupta-era doctor, ignoring this data would be like a modern doctor refusing to look at an X-ray or a blood test. It was essential information. Their worldview lacked our modern sense of microbial disgust. While they had strong concepts of ritual purity, the idea that these substances were teeming with invisible, disease-causing organisms was unknown. They were seen simply as byproducts, indicators of the body's hidden state. Therefore, the physician's willingness to engage with them was not seen as repulsive, but as a sign of his dedication and thoroughness. He was a master of a secret language, the language of the body's outputs. His high social status gave him the authority to conduct these intimate examinations, and his perceived wisdom allowed him to interpret what he found. It was the ultimate expression of the idea that to heal the body, you must first understand it, and to understand it, you must not be afraid to confront its raw, unglamorous reality. The wise sage with his hand on the patient's pulse is the sandalwood illusion. The reality is that same sage, moments later, dutifully tasting a sample of urine to arrive at a diagnosis. The pursuit of health, like the pursuit of power and wealth, required a willingness to get your hands dirty sometimes, quite literally. All of these interconnected systems, the industrial forges, the ambitious universities, the paranoid kings, the pragmatic physicians, are part of a complex, dynamic, and ultimately fragile imperial machine. But nothing lasts forever. Even an empire forged in iron and cloaked in sandalwood must eventually fade. We have spent our journey wandering through the secret realities of the Gupta Golden Age, from the fire of the forge to the fear on the throne. Now, let's pull back. Let's float up high above. The city of Pataliputra, high above the rock-cut temples and the irrigated fields. The glamorous illusion of the empire, from this great height, was one of permanence. The stone temples seemed eternal, the iron pillar indestructible, the mathematical knowledge universal. The poets wrote of kings whose glory would last as long as the sun and moon. The whole machinery of the state, from its perfumed courts to its golden coins, was designed to project an image of an empire that was a fixed and final state of things, the culmination of civilization. But as we hang here, suspended in time, we begin to feel a change. A slow, creeping decay. The shocking reality is that this magnificent, complex machine was already beginning to break down. The decline of the Gupta Empire was not a single, dramatic event. It was a slow, grinding process, a fading of vibrancy, a tarnishing of the gold. From our vantage point, we can see the symptoms appearing like cracks in a great mural. On the northwestern frontier, you see the dust clouds of invading armies, the Huna people, a branch of the Huns who wreaked havoc in Europe. Their repeated invasions were not always successful, but they were incredibly costly, draining the imperial treasury and manpower. Look at the coins again. Remember the debasement. The later Gupta dinars become lighter, the gold less pure, the images cruder. This is a sign of an empire in economic distress, unable to afford the pristine symbols of its former glory. Listen to the countryside. The water disputes grow more frequent and more violent as the central authority weakens, unable to maintain the canals and reservoirs or to enforce its rulings. The once great trade routes become less secure, and the flow of wealth, the lifeblood of the cities, begins to slow. In the universities, the fierce intellectual debates continue, but perhaps with less originality, a greater reliance on commenting on the past masters rather than forging new ideas. The system is becoming brittle. And what about our central sensory theme? The sandalwood and the iron. The scent of sandalwood in the court begins to feel less like a confident expression of power and more like a desperate attempt to mask the smell of decay. It's a perfume sprayed in a room that is growing stale. And the iron. The forges are still working, but perhaps they are producing more weapons for defense than tools for building. The metallurgical knowledge that was a source of strength becomes a resource for a long, losing battle. The empire is turning inward. The grand project is no longer expansion and innovation. It is maintenance and survival. The why of this decline is complex and debated by historians to this day. There was no single cause. It was the culmination of all the hidden pressures we have observed. The immense cost of maintaining the illusion of divine kingship, the internal power struggles between ambitious princes, the overextension of a military trying to defend vast borders, the social tensions inherent in a rigid caste system, the eventual breakdown of the economic systems of taxation and trade. The empire, which seemed so solid, was in fact a highly complex system, and like any complex system, it was vulnerable to shocks and internal decay. The very things that made it strong, its powerful military, its centralized authority, its complex economy, also made it fragile. The Hunar invasions were not the cause of the collapse, but rather a massive external shock that exploited the pre-existing weaknesses and accelerated the decline. The Golden Age did not end with a bang. It ended with a long, slow sigh. It was a gradual fading of the light, a cooling of the forge. The intricate systems of control and production began to fray and fall apart. The beautiful lie of effortless perfection could no longer be sustained. The reality of entropy, of conflict, of economic hardship, which had always been there, bubbling just beneath the surface, finally broke through and washed the sandalwood scent away. The memory of the empire would live on, but its vibrant, complex, and often contradictory reality would be forgotten, buried under the simplified story of a golden age, a myth as beautiful and as misleading as the perfumed air of the court itself. As the sun sets on this once great empire, the world grows quiet. The rhythmic thump of the forge has ceased, and the debates in the halls of Nalanda have fallen silent. The once bustling cities now stand as monuments to a faded glory, their secrets slowly being reclaimed by the earth. You can feel the energy receding, the sharp focus of our journey softening as the details blur into the twilight of history. The iron begins to cool, the perfumes have long since evaporated into the vastness of time, and the weight of all that ambition and fear and brilliance begins to settle, like dust, upon a forgotten landscape. We can let go now of the shocking realities, the stark contrasts that kept our minds alert, and allow the gentle, overarching illusion of a time long past to become a soft blanket. The story is over. The secrets have been whispered, and all that remains is the quiet hum of the centuries, a soothing, deep sound that invites you to rest. The frantic energy of creation, the high-stakes games of power, the intense concentration of the scholar and the smith have all dissolved into a peaceful, dreamlike memory. There is nothing left to analyze, nothing to uncover. There is only this stillness, this sense of immense distance, a quiet field where a great civilization once stood. And in this quiet, you can finally allow your own thoughts to drift, to soften, and to fade into a well-deserved, peaceful sleep. End of script. Sweet dreams.